Welcome back to the briefing. There is a number that defines the most intense bombing rate since World War II, and that number is 20,000. 20,000 bombs dropped by the United States and Israel on Iran in less than 3 weeks. One bomb every minute for 3 continuous weeks. And the result is not an Iranian collapse. It is the expansion of the war to multiple simultaneous fronts, the destruction of global energy infrastructure that will take years to rebuild, and the complete diplomatic isolation of the United States, while China launches naval blockade exercises against Taiwan precisely while Washington is trapped in the Middle East. Let that sink in, because this is not about the volume of munitions deployed, it is about the fundamental failure of a doctrine that assumes superior air power produces victory when the adversary adopts a strategy of accepting punishment and remaining standing until the political cost of continuing the war exceeds the benefit of victory. Iran is not trying to win militarily, it is implementing what they call the Rocky Balboa strategy. Absorb blows, remain standing, keep Hormuz closed, attack the energy infrastructure of American allies. Wait until inflation and energy shortages destroy domestic support for Trump and Netanyahu. And it is working because Trump is so isolated that he cannot even get allies to provide escort ships for Hormuz. Stay with me, because this is not about isolated Iranian resilience. It is about the simultaneous collapse of multiple American strategic assumptions. The assumption that massive bombing produces surrender, the assumption that allies will support American operations, the assumption that China will not take advantage of the United States' distraction, the assumption that energy infrastructure can be protected. All those assumptions are collapsing simultaneously as the war expands to Lebanon, Iraq faces state collapse, and Qatar loses 17% of its LNG export capacity for 3 to 5 years. Qatar lost 17% of its LNG export capacity. 17% is not a temporary interruption. It is a structural loss that requires 3 to 5 years to repair. The Ras Laffan complex suffered severe damage to 2 of its 14 production blocks and 1 conversion block. Qatar loses 10 billion annually, 40 to 50 billion in total. The global market loses 3.5% of its LNG supply for years. That is not volatility. It is a structural shortage that Europe and Asia will face every winter until capacity is rebuilt. Iraq lost 70% of its oil production because Hormuz is closed. Iraq derived 88% of its state budget from oil exports, 87 billion. When you lose 88% of government revenue, you stop paying salaries, the military, the police. When the government stops paying people with guns, they look for other ways to get income. Iraq is on the verge of complete state collapse because a war it did not ask for closed its only export route. Iraq is trying to redirect 400,000 barrels a day through the Kirkuk-Turkey pipeline. Before the war, Iraq exported more than 3 million daily. 400,000 is not a solution. It is a desperate measure that provides a fraction of the necessary revenue. When Iraq collapses, fields like Rumaila that produce 1.5 million daily become unprotected targets. Iran launched cluster munitions on Israeli cities. Cluster munitions release submunitions over a wide area from high altitude. Iron Dome is designed to intercept rockets with predictable trajectories. It is not designed to intercept hundreds of submunitions scattering unpredictably over an urban area. When one projectile becomes 100 separate impacts, the mathematics of interception collapse completely. Rishon LeZion, Kiryat Ono, and Rehovot were hit. 3 people died in the West Bank. 13 were injured. The Bazan refinery in Haifa suffered shrapnel damage to external infrastructure. And the Israeli education minister canceled Passover camps in 18 municipalities in central Israel. Canceling Passover camps in 18 municipalities is not a minor precaution. It is an admission that the government cannot guarantee the safety of children in central Israel. Central Israel includes Tel Aviv. It includes cities that were historically considered safe. And now the government is telling families they cannot send children to camps because the risk of cluster munitions is too high. That is not crisis management. It is an admission that air defense cannot protect the civilian population from the type of threat Iran is deploying. Trump asked China and Japan for help to provide escort ships in Hormuz. Both refused. Allies and adversaries watched the president ask for help for an operation he initiated unilaterally and said no. China refused, and then launched naval blockade exercises against Taiwan on March 16th. While the United States bombs Iran, China demonstrates that it can blockade Taiwan without the United States doing anything to stop it because it has no resources available to respond to a crisis in the Pacific while fighting a war in the Middle East. NATO describes the war as Trump's personal Vietnam. Trump's personal Vietnam. European allies do not see this as a defense of shared interests. They see it as an ill-conceived military adventure that Trump initiated without consulting allies and now expects allies to rescue when it fails. And they flatly refuse. They are facing an energy crisis caused by a war they did not support, and now Trump threatens a very bad future if they do not help. Threatening allies who are already facing an energy crisis because of your war does not produce cooperation. It produces deep resentment. Trump postponed a trip to China scheduled for late March. He postponed it because the situation in the Middle East is too volatile for him to leave the country. That is an admission that the war is not under control. If the war were proceeding according to plan, the president could make the scheduled diplomatic trip. When you must cancel diplomacy because you cannot leave a crisis situation, the crisis is not being managed. It is escalating. Hezbollah responds to Israeli ground operations south of the Litani River by launching rockets directly at Tel Aviv. Directly at Tel Aviv means they are no longer limiting attacks to northern Israel. They are hitting a population center. And Israeli warning systems are being disrupted. When warning systems fail, the civilian population receives no warning of incoming attacks. That maximizes civilian casualties and creates terror that makes it impossible for normal life to continue. Since February 28th, 1,300 people have died in Iran, 960 in Lebanon, 14 in Israel, 13 American military personnel, 200 American military personnel wounded, 1 million people displaced in Lebanon, 1 million, not refugees crossing borders. Internally displaced persons forced to abandon their homes because the area where they lived became uninhabitable due to bombing. When you displace 1 million people, you don't just cause humanitarian suffering. You create political pressure on the government that must house and feed those people while the war continues. Saudi Arabia redirected 30 supertankers to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. 30 supertankers carrying 2 million barrels each, 60 million barrels in transit through the Petroline pipeline to Yanbu because Hormuz is closed. The United Arab Emirates depends on the pipeline and the port of Fujairah, which transports 1.5 million barrels daily, and Fujairah is already experiencing drone attacks and fires. Petroline and Fujairah are the last two critical energy arteries. If Iran or its proxies close those two, there is no remaining export route. The global energy supply collapses completely. An Israeli F-16 was hit by an Iranian surface-to-air missile over central Iranian airspace. Israel admitted that the plane was hit by a missile, although it denies it was completely shot down. Admitting the plane was hit is admitting that Iranian air defenses can track and hit Israeli planes even after 3 weeks of intensive bombing designed specifically to destroy Iranian air defenses. 20,000 bombs dropped and Iranian air defenses still function well enough to hit an F-16. That is a failure of the suppression of enemy air defenses campaign. The entire global energy supply now depends on just 2 pipelines, Petroline in Saudi Arabia and Fujairah in the Emirates. 2. If those 2 are disrupted, there is no alternative. Europe collapses, Asia collapses, the global economy collapses, and protecting 2 pipelines against drone attacks from Iranian proxies when you cannot reopen Hormuz is mathematically impossible. You cannot patrol every kilometer of 2 pipelines 24 hours a day against asymmetric threats that cost a fraction to defend against. The Rocky Balboa strategy means accepting 20,000 bombs, remaining standing, keeping Hormuz closed, attacking energy infrastructure until the political cost for Trump and Netanyahu exceeds the benefit of continuing. And it works because Trump is isolated, China takes advantage, NATO refuses, Iraq collapses, Qatar loses 17% for years, cluster munitions collapse Iron Dome, Passover camps are canceled, an F-16 is hit, and the global supply depends on two pipelines that cannot be protected. And here is the calculation that no one in Washington wants to admit publicly. When you drop 20,000 bombs in 3 weeks and the adversary not only remains operational, but expands the war to multiple fronts, you have demonstrated that strategic bombing does not produce a collapse against an adversary prepared to absorb punishment. And when you demonstrate that, every future adversary learns that they can survive American bombing if they are willing to accept the cost and have a strategy to inflict an asymmetric cost that eventually makes continuing unacceptable for Washington. Iraq faces state collapse not because it chose to participate in the war, but because geography placed it between adversaries and its only export route was closed as collateral damage. When states collapse as collateral damage of wars they did not choose, it creates a precedent that neutrality provides no protection. And when neutrality does not protect, states seek alliances that provide real security guarantees. That pushes countries toward China and Russia, who haven't dropped 20,000 bombs in 3 weeks on anyone recently. 3 to 5 years to repair Ras Laffan means that Europe and Asia will face LNG shortages every winter until 2030. Every winter, for years. That is not a crisis that gets resolved with reserve releases or temporary agreements. It is a structural reality that requires the physical reconstruction of destroyed infrastructure. And while that reconstruction occurs, prices remain high. Energy-heavy industries relocate to regions with cheaper energy, and the competitive advantage of European economies erodes permanently. 1 million displaced people in Lebanon creates pressure on Hezbollah to escalate attacks against Israel because the displaced population demands retaliation for the loss of their homes. The Lebanese government cannot order Hezbollah to stop attacks when the population Hezbollah represents has lost their homes to Israeli bombings. So Hezbollah escalates. Israel responds by escalating ground operations, which produces more displaced people, which produces more pressure to escalate. That is a feedback loop where each escalation produces the conditions that guarantee the next escalation. What happens when you drop 20,000 bombs but the adversary remains operational? What happens when allies refuse to help? What happens when China launches a blockade of Taiwan while you are distracted? What happens when Qatar loses 17% of its LNG for years? What happens when Iraq loses 88% of its budget? What happens when cluster munitions collapse air defense? What happens when the last two energy arteries cannot be protected? You are in a war where force does not produce victory. It produces expansion, where allies refuse, where adversaries take advantage, where critical infrastructure is permanently destroyed, and where the strategy of absorbing punishment while inflicting unsustainable economic cost is winning because Washington is isolated and options are exhausted.